Eating meat is not easy. Meat is the body of another animal, an animal that runs, that tries to avoid being captured. Hunters need great physical capacity, and every attempt is a risk. Failures are frequent, and with each one, hunger increases and energy is reduced. That is why the majority of the survivors of the planet Earth use a different system to obtain food. Gathering means collecting, accumulating different things. Gather animals spend their whole time moving around, almost always eating grasses, fruits and leaves, but often they also come across honey, insects or eggs which supplement their diet. Vegetables generally have fewer proteins than meat, but they're all around and do not flee. So the only thing you need to do is eat a great quantity of them, and at the same time try to make sure the carnivores do not eat you. Hunters and gatherers, both systems have their pros and their cons. Hunters may spend weeks between one meal and the next, periods of enforced fasting which are compensated for when they are successful. The primates, well adapted to eating fruits up in the trees, always complement their diet with insects and eggs they occasionally find, and they conserved this custom when they came down from the trees some 15 million years ago. However, gathering plants sometimes forces them to travel long distances. Droughts began and the herds had to migrate in search of places with water and vegetation. They were followed by another type of killer, a descendant of vegetarians who had acquired a taste for meat. Man applied all his intelligence to hunting, inventing all kinds of tricks to compete with large carnivores. Unlike them, he soon realized that the life of the hunter is too uncertain, and that a growing population of humans could not depend exclusively on meat. The solution was to combine the two systems, to gather fruits, berries, roots and leaves to see them through the long periods of unsuccessful hunting. But then humans asked themselves, what would happen if, instead of going out in search of food, I grew it right here by my house? That thought was to change the planet. In the interior of these jungles on the island of Borneo lives a primate whose knowledge of botany is incredible. It can spend months up in the trees looking for fruit without ever coming down to the ground. That animal is the orangutan. But in this world of apparent abundance, gathering plants is not as simple as it seems. Not all the trees bear fruit at the same time, and sometimes not even all the branches of the same tree. The orangutan has a memory capable of recognizing over 400 different types of food. It must remember the exact place of each species of tree and the approximate date on which the fruits mature. It must also avoid the poisonous parts of some of them, as well as the thorns or hard skins. All of this it learns from its mother over years, observing her on her wanderings around the jungle. An efficient gatherer like the orangutan, and like our simian ancestors, must have good sight in order to recognize the bright colors of the fruits in the jungle, while the carnivores see in black and white, giving preference to movement and nocturnal vision. A good gatherer has a discerning palate to distinguish the sweet flavor of ripe fruits and taste them to remove the indigestible parts. Carnivores, on the other hand, swallowed large pieces of meat without tasting them at all. A gatherer must have hands with agile fingers to peel the fruits and cling onto the branches, whereas a carnivore prefers claws. Finally, a gatherer needs a large, efficient brain to remember every corner of its habitat. The orangutan teaches us that a lot of what we have in common is due to the fact that, like it, we too were once gatherers. The problem is that adaptation to a specific vegetarian diet means that the animal becomes entirely dependent on certain vegetable species. That is exactly what happened to the lemurs on the island of Madagascar, just 400 kilometers from the southeast coast of Africa. The lemurs are in reality ancient primates, very similar to the ancestor which would later give rise to all the different monkeys. They are therefore called proto-simians. The lemurs became isolated in Madagascar before this happened, and unlike everywhere else on the planet, were saved from extinction there. In this way, the lemurs followed their parallel evolution and adapted to the different habitats and plant foods of the island. Today, 33 species of lemur survive, so totally specialized that almost all depend on the bush and tree species on which they feed, which grow only in Madagascar. They could not, therefore, live anywhere else, even if they wanted to. With all the characteristics of a jungle-dwelling, fruit-eating primate, including the most efficient brain on the planet, humans took gathering to limits never before reached by any animal. In the same way as these Australian Aborigines still do today, humans became great specialists, adapted to different types of food. So, if a given resource became scarce, this was immediately compensated for by the abundance of another. Memory and experience were gradually accumulated among human clans, which spread throughout the world thanks to their ability to gather not only vegetable foods, but also the energy reserves accumulated by other animals in the form of honey, wax, or eggs. Progressive knowledge of the habits of other animals led the insatiable human gatherer to try virtually everything. With the discerning palate of the simians, man began to appreciate an increasing variety of foods and incorporated them into his culture as one more mark of identity. Again, the cultural progress of the human species happened so quickly that in just a few generations it had colonized virtually the entire planet. The human hunter-gatherer passed on increasingly efficient techniques to his children and grandchildren, and so an invaluable store of knowledge was accumulated. Our ancestors survived in this way for some 2 million years. Even today we can learn much if we are capable of interpreting the information contained in these prehistorical paintings and petroglyphs. But as our ancestors evolved, the climate continued to change and large areas of forest were progressively replaced by bush savanna at the edge of the desert. Then the groups of hominids had to cope with harsher conditions as still today occurs on the other side of the planet. These men are Bushmen or San, one of the few remaining groups of true hunter-gatherers still surviving in the 21st century. The Bushmen are interesting not only for their culture. Even physiologically, they are different from other human groups because they are adapted to the desert. Their dark yellowish skin has a wrinkled appearance due to the fact they do not have a subcutaneous fat. They are short with small teeth, eye folds and very curly hair. Only some 50,000 remain, but they still conserve most of the knowledge that has enabled them to survive for over 10,000 years in the Kalahari Desert. 80% of their diet is vegetable. They gather around 100 different species of roots, bulbs and nuts. Anthropological studies have demonstrated that this diet is surprisingly rich and complete, and that it gives the Bushmen long life with almost no symptoms of anxiety or insecurity. The small Bushmen have conquered this hostile environment. But what happens when the same problems are faced by the largest mammal on the planet? To maintain the 7,000 kilos which an adult elephant can weigh on the basis of a vegetarian diet, they need to spend a lot of time eating and searching. In fact, they spend 3/4 of their life doing just that. A large male consumes around 300 kilos of food a day and the same number of liters of water. Therefore, a large herd must constantly be on the move because it exhausts an area in just a few hours. However, a large part of Africa owes much to the elephants, and to a considerable extent this is due to the fact that their digestive system is not very efficient. Of the vegetable matter they consume, almost 80% is expelled, virtually undigested. In this way, the nutrients which over many years the roots of the trees had taken from deep down in the soil are returned to the surface, fertilizing it. If we take into account the fact that an elephant defecates around 30 times a year and produces some 275 kilos of manure, we can see just how important this is. In addition, it transports seeds which are then expelled at a considerable distance from where they were ingested and deposit them with their dose of natural fertilizers, thus guaranteeing germination. They are, therefore, the great gardeners of Africa. If the elephants must travel long distances in search of plants, on the other side of the planet, there is another species that also has considerable difficulties in this respect. Sometimes a gatherer's main problem is simply reaching the places where their food grows. These marine iguanas on the Galapagos Islands are reptiles, generally called cold-blooded, when in fact they simply need the sun to heat up their bodies. That would not be a problem in a climate like this if it were not for the fact that they eat seaweed, and here the Humboldt Current makes the water very cold. They have to go where the waves break or enter the frozen water in order to eat. Then their body temperature gradually drops, making their movements increasingly slow and clumsy. They must quickly warm up or else they will die. After a while in the sun, they recover, but then they need to eat even more. One after another, they dive back into the cold water, each time forced to swim further out to find the most nutritional banks of seaweed. The further they go, the greater the risk. They must start back when their body temperature is still high enough to allow them to reach the shore. If they calculate badly and cool down too much, their muscles will stop working and they will freeze to death. Some feeding in calm waters have less to worry about, but there the seaweed is of lower nutritional quality than in rougher, better oxygenated water. On the verge of hypothermia, these warriors of the sea return to the rocks heated up by the equatorial sun. Their lives are a constant fine balance of energy which at any moment could turn against them. That is the price they must pay for exploiting a resource which no one will steal from them. The human hunter-gatherer rapidly refined his techniques, mastering his environment. Then he learned that instead of going in search of the plants where they grew, undergoing hardships like the elephants or the marine iguanas, he could plant them himself right by his home. A clearing in the forest, a refuge and a garden, this was the birth of agriculture, and with it, sedentary man. This took place some 10,000 years ago, and was called the Neolithic Revolution. Agriculture as such arose independently in various different regions of the world and was the first of the great cultural advances which have transformed the planet, permitting human populations to multiply. Then, as happened here in the Trobriand Islands near New Guinea, the inhabitants managed to achieve increasingly large harvests, making it possible to store the excess for consumption in times of want. The result was a guaranteed supply of food all year round. This is the so-called yam house, the most important building in the village, where they proudly store the annual harvest, whose size and quality brings prestige to the clan. The produce is displayed and blessed by the spiritual chief of the village. The best yam farmer is honored with the name Tokwai Bagula, which means good gardener. Agriculture brought human beings the possibility of leisure, of free time, as released them from the interminable search for food and refuge. But just as in the case of the lemurs, excessive dependence on a few vegetable species to feed large numbers of people can be dangerous. Today, over 99% of the world's food is plant species, and of these, wheat, rice and maize represent 80%. We have become specialists in just 3 species, and if a virus attacked these crops, it would be a world catastrophe. Even worse, the population of the planet doubled in just 50 years at the end of the 20th century, while demand for meat quadrupled. To produce 1 kilo of beef, 8 kilos of grain are necessary. That means that the cattle eat 40% of all the cereals harvested on the planet. What began as an evolutionary success of the primates, the diversification of our diet, should not now be allowed to lead to an impoverishment in species due to monocultivation and the global economy. The balance was upset when we began to sell, and ecology became economy. Perhaps once more triumph lies somewhere between the 2 extremes, knowing how to take success on board without going too far. Here in the tropical forest of Venezuela, the Maquiritare still live in self-sufficient communities whose contact with the outside world is limited to the acquisition of certain plastic utensils from nearby villages. After gathering in the manioc from the fields, they grate it, turning it into tapioca, a wet pulp, which must be then squeezed in long baskets to extract the hydrocyanide acid, which is poisonous. The result is a kind of paste from which the Maquiritare prepare their favorite food. The food in question is the casabe or jungle bread, a toasted flat bread which forms the basis of their diet. At this point, another step in the cultural evolution of the human gatherer occurs. The harvested food is increasingly processed, leading to cooking, gastronomy, the meeting of the family and the clan around the fire or stove, and so eating becomes much more than simple ingestion of food. It then becomes a social act, strengthening bonds, so much so that there is virtually no human culture in the world that does not celebrate important events with a corresponding banquet. In the highlands of New Guinea, these Papuans are going to prepare one of the most complicated and ingenious vegetable recipes in the world, the momo. It is a true ritual in which the entire village participates, a tradition governed by ancestral rules. Sweet bananas, squashes, maize, yam, potatoes, and other local vegetables are placed in layers in a large pressure cooker in the form of a hole lined with stones and banana leaves. That sense of taste which enabled our relative, the orangutan, to distinguish the ripe fruits now brings us the immense pleasure of widely varied flavors after millions of years of biological evolution and just a few thousand of cultural progress. No pure carnivore could enjoy food in this way. Only the descendants of an ancient lineage of gatherer simians are capable of appreciating subtleties, aromas, and nuances like these. Sometimes survival brings unexpected rewards.